Tonight at 10, 30 years after the NHS contaminated blood scandal, the government finally orders an inquiry. More than 2,000 people died and thousands of victims were left infected with HIV and hepatitis C.
The inquiry that I've announced today will give them those answers, so they will know why this happened, how it happened. This was an appalling tragedy and it should never have happened.
Andy Evans was infected when he was 5 and contracted AIDS at 16. He's campaigned for an inquiry for years.
At the very minimum, we were let down. At the worst, I think, there are people to blame for a lot of the infections that occurred.
We'll be asking why victims have had to wait so long for answers. Good evening. An appalling tragedy that should never have happened. That's what the Prime Minister called the contaminated blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s as the government announced an inquiry into what's been called one of the biggest disasters in the history of the NHS. At least 2,400 people died and 7,500 patients were infected with viruses such as hepatitis C and HIV after being given blood products by the NHS. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
So these are the medications for HIV.
Andy has had a life on medication because he was given contaminated blood. At the age of 5, he was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. At 16, he developed AIDS. Since then, all he's wanted is answers.
I'm very worried that there was deliberate acts behind these infections. As I say, at the very minimum, we were let down. At the worst, I think, there are people to blame for a lot of the infections that occurred.
It's been called the worst disaster in the history of the NHS. Patients expected safe treatment, haemophiliacs needing blood clotting agents and others needing transfusions, but they were given products tainted with life-threatening viruses. Much of the inquiry's focus will be on Whitehall and what was happening here more than 30 years ago. Victims and their families have long argued that senior government officials were aware of the dangers with contaminated blood products, but allowed patients to continue receiving them. And after that, they say, there was a cover-up. A Scottish inquiry by a Judge Lord Penrose was dismissed by victims as a waste of time, and they showed what they thought of it. An earlier inquiry in England was privately funded with no official status. Today, a Labour MP who's campaigned on the issue told the Commons those affected by the scandal were owed a debt of justice.
They deserve to be told what went wrong, why it went wrong, and who is responsible for what happened. The story of the injustice they have suffered also needs to be set out and told to the wider public. Their voices need to be heard.
The Prime Minister later said their voices would be heard in the newly announced inquiry.
It's affected so many people and they have waited too long for these answers. What we want to do is talk with the families, talk to them about the shape that this inquiry should take, so we ensure that it is able to provide the answers and the justice that they want and deserve.
The former Health Secretary Andy Burnham, who's alleged it's a criminal matter with medical records falsified, says there were failures by successive governments.
All political parties have let down those who've suffered as a result of contaminated blood, and all parties must now put differences aside, work together and give them truth and justice without any further delay or obstruction.
And for this campaigner who has hepatitis C, there's only one thing which really matters.
Nobody here is going away. We are staying, we're going to fight, and we want to know the truth. We just want the truth. That is all. That is all.
Whether that full truth emerges after this long campaign will depend on what sort of inquiry is convened and its powers.
And Hugh is with me now. Why have the victims had to wait so long for this inquiry?
Well, Sophie, the government line is it's always had an open mind, but just in the last few weeks, new evidence has emerged, some published in the newspaper, and there's other material held by Andy Burnham alleging criminality, which he's ready to hand over to police. But you know, there is a political aspect to this. Only on Sunday, the leaders of the main opposition parties at Westminster, including the DUP, wrote a joint letter calling for a public inquiry into this scandal. And that's highly significant given the parliamentary arithmetic these days. So with a debate due to start at Westminster today, called by a Labour MP, with further calls for an inquiry, the government said it would take just such a move. That came as a surprise to the Scottish government, who said they welcomed it. It will be a UK-wide exercise. But you know, whatever the reasons, whatever the factors, the victims and their families have welcomed what they see as a landmark move, but they've yet to be convinced it really will deliver the truth.
Hugh Pym, thank you.